Good evening. Time to relax. Get comfortable and let Daddy tuck you in with a bedtime story. The Weight of Wednesday Evenings. The Weight of Wednesday Evenings. For 25 years, Marcus had counted the days until Wednesday evening, when the ritual would begin again in Grace Henderson's dining room. The mahogany table would gleam under the warm light of the crystal chandelier, and the familiar faces would gather. Wives with their careful smiles, friends with their comfortable complaints about weather and children and the rising cost of everything. But Marcus came for David, though he would never have admitted this, not even to himself, not even in the darkest hours before dawn when truth sometimes visited uninvited. They had met as young husbands in 1962, fresh-faced and optimistic, their wives already planning the social calendar that would bind their lives together. Marcus remembered the moment their hands first touched across that church social table laden with casseroles, how David's palm had lingered against his own, warm and slightly damp, a heartbeat longer than propriety demanded. Something had passed between them then. A recognition, perhaps, or a warning. Marcus had felt it like electricity, like the first intimation of a storm still gathering on a distant horizon. The Wednesday dinners became their sacrament, their weekly communion in a church built of silence and stolen glances. Marcus learned to read the weather of David's moods in the small gestures no one else noticed. The way he stirred his coffee counterclockwise when content, clockwise when troubled. How he twisted his wedding ring when nervous, like a prayer wheel worn smooth by constant handling. The difference between his public laugh, bright and performed, and the softer, more genuine sound Marcus could sometimes coax from him during their brief conversations in the kitchen while their wives discussed the children's schools. Over the years, their connection deepened not through words, but through the endless repetition of small intimacies. A hand brushing a sleeve when passing the salt, eyes meeting across the candlelight and holding just a moment too long before politeness demanded they look away. The comfortable silence that would sometimes fall between them when the women's voices faded to background music and the world narrowed to just the two of them, standing close enough to touch, but never daring. They were men shaped by duty, by the unspoken rules of their fathers and the cold expectations of a world that had no place for what they felt. There was a quiet pact between them, a devotion as fierce as it was futile. They spoke of art and politics, of weather and grandchildren, but never of the profound ache that settled in Marcus's chest whenever David laughed at one of his jokes. Never of the way David's presence seemed to make the air itself more breathable. There had been one night, October 1978, unseasonably warm, when the weight of unspoken words had nearly crushed them both. They had found themselves alone on the Hendersons' back porch, while the others watched television inside. David had been drinking more than usual, his careful composure slightly askew. "Marcus," he had said, and the way he spoke the name was like a prayer, like a confession. "Sometimes I think about what it would be like if we were different people, if we lived in a different world." Marcus had felt his heart stop, then restart with painful intensity. They stood there in the darkness, two middle-aged men with mortgages and responsibilities, and wives who loved them in their own ways, and Marcus felt the full weight of his life pressing down on him like water. He had wanted to reach out, to take David's hand, to say all the things he had been carrying in his chest for 16 years. Instead, he had cleared his throat and suggested they rejoin the others. They never spoke of that night again, but something had shifted between them, a deepening of their shared understanding, a recognition of the sacred, impossible country they inhabited together. A place that existed only in the space between their bodies, in the fleeting touch of fingers, in the profound silence that held all their unspoken truths. Now, on this final Wednesday in March 1987, Marcus sat in his familiar chair and watched David push food around his plate. The announcement had come 3 weeks ago. David's company was transferring him to Seattle. A promotion, Sarah had said proudly. A wonderful opportunity. They would be leaving at the end of the month. The evening passed in a blur of forced cheer, everyone speaking of new beginnings and keeping in touch. Marcus nodded and smiled and made appropriate responses, but inside he felt like he was drowning. 25 years of Wednesday evenings, ending not with drama or revelation, but with the quiet efficiency of a corporate relocation. After dinner, as had become their custom, the men stepped outside while the women discussed logistics. The March air was crisp, carrying the promise of spring, and Marcus found himself memorizing everything. The way the porch light caught the silver in David's hair, the sound of his breathing in the quiet evening, the familiar scent of his aftershave. "I'm going to miss this," David said quietly, and Marcus knew he didn't just mean the dinners. "Yes," Marcus replied, because there were no words big enough to hold 25 years of careful love. In the gathering darkness, they stood as they had stood countless times before. Two men who had loved each other the only way they knew how, in silence, in secret, across a quarter-century of Wednesday evenings that had been, perhaps, the most honest moments of their lives. The weight of unspoken words settled around them like a benediction, heavy and sacred, and finally, mercifully, shared. Inside, their wives were laughing about something, their voices bright with the easy intimacy of old friendship. Soon, the evening would end as all their evenings ended, with promises and careful handshakes goodbye. David would move to Seattle, and Marcus would continue his Wednesday evenings with other friends. Other conversations that would never quite fill the space David's absence would leave behind. But for now, for just a few more minutes, they allowed themselves this. The profound understanding that had sustained them. The love that had lived only in the margins but endured, fierce and true, like a flame cupped against an endless wind.